In a world where even the smallest disagreements can lead to arguments, violence, and even death, two brothers tackle the difficult subjects. This podcast is not just about dissecting topics from two different perspectives. It's also about how to have conversations on difficult topics while avoiding the urge to tear someone's head off and vomit down the bloody stump of their neck.
So this conversation is going to be sort of a meta conversation, a conversation about the conversations. And as I had mentioned to you, Colin, the reason why I wanted to have this conversation was because I had what I thought was the perfect argument, the argument that was going to change your mind, that was going to draw you from the darkness to the light, to show you the error in your ways. And when the argument didn't do that, I was a little surprised. And so it got me thinking about the overall experience that we're having. And one of the thoughts that I had was that I'm fairly certain you'd had those moments as well. So I thought we could talk about that, but I also just wanted to talk about the overall experience of how this is going, what we like, what we don't like, how we feel it's impacted anything, if it has impacted anything.
Yeah. I'm interested to know. I imagine that your argument that you're talking about was your argument that, hey, you shouldn't be comparing Social Security to an investment account. You should be comparing it to an annuity. Is that the argument you're talking about that you thought would convince me?
Well, no, not so much that one. I mean, I still do feel like it's a valid point, but the argument was actually where in the midst of that conversation, I pulled up a bunch of statistics and numbers and facts and showed that at the lowest income, or at the poverty level, that line, that threshold that has been sort of decided upon, that people can't afford housing. And these were numbers that were put out by various government agencies and certain statistics that are recognized as being valid. And so I figured, here's a mathematically factual basis for my point of view. Surely he would recognize the validity of the math. And it's not so much that you didn't recognize the validity of the math, you just sort of turn the argument into a different direction, or turn the conversation in a different direction.
And you felt that when you pointed out the fact that it was difficult for people at that level to afford housing, and there are a lot of people at that level, that I would say, okay, we need Social Security, or what?
No, it was more that it was more the actually, I'm sorry, it wasn't about Social Security. The conversation we were talking about poverty. I apologize. I gotten confused. We were talking about poverty and what we can do to alleviate poverty. And my argument was that that there is a benefit to having some of these safety nets, and in fact, the safety nets that we have are not sufficient. For example, here's my argument about yada yada yada. That housing is not affordable at the poverty threshold. Therefore, the poverty threshold is not accurate.
Yeah. I guess we could quibble about the numbers and where they came from and everything else, but I felt like my counter argument at that point, I didn't feel that I was turning from it. I felt and if I'm remembering correctly, it'd be interesting to go back and listen to the video. I hope I'm remembering correctly. But I feel, if I remember correctly, my argument was, what we're saying is that there's a problem, and I would say that government has caused it. It's almost as if we keep implementing. Well, first off, I guess I should say we should have the social safety nets, and I hope that's been clear in all of my conversations.
Absolutely.
Neither of us are saying, hey, somebody is poor or going to starve to death. We're not saying like, hey, you didn't work hard enough, bye, go die or something. We're not. Neither one of us are saying that. So the safety net is a good thing. It's a question of how much of a safety net, what's the ultimate purpose of it, and who we give it to, and everything else. So if we're talking about somebody who's got a severe disability, we should take care of them. If we're talking about somebody who's even fallen on hard times, bad luck or even poor choices, I don't think either one of us is going to say, hey, let's just let that person starve to death. It's pretty rare that would happen. But we would say, yeah, let's make sure we're taking care of that person. I think where you and I differ is how much we should care for those people, meaning I hope that I've shown in that conversation and in others that there can be disincentives to work. That, for example, if you have somebody that, let's say they're getting some assistance from the federal government or from a state government, and then they know that if they make another dollar or if they work a little bit harder, they're going to lose that incentive. That's a disincentive to work. And it's going to be hard for them to pull themselves out of poverty or to work their way out of poverty or to even get out of poverty, even if we were to help them. So I think, that's where some of what we were saying was, that was part of the issue. And the other part of the issue I would say is, it was a good argument that, it is difficult for people that are not making that much money to get out of, or to afford housing, to afford their needs and everything, or to afford to pay for what they need and everything else. My point was then, how much of that is caused by government? It's almost as if we keep implementing all these programs, they make things worse, and then we say, well, how are these people supposed to survive without government assistance? Does that make any sense? And it's a little bit of a difficult argument to make, but I feel like I have made it over the course of our arguments. We know people, Brian, that if they make $1,000 more, they lose like $10,000 or $15,000 worth of assistance. So their income, and if they have children, they realize, well, I can work a little bit harder and not see my kids and make that sacrifice so that in the long term we're better off. But if I do, I'm not seeing my kids and I make less money.
Right.
So they have a difficult choice there.
And then I think this sort of illustrates some of the challenges that you and I have run across in terms of how these discussions go. It's almost like our arguments are passing each other by. Whereas I'm arguing in this situation, I'm arguing that the support is not sufficient, and you're arguing that the support is not really relevant because the problem is created by the people that are also providing the support. And so the arguments almost never really meet head on. And I think it's an interesting challenge that we typically would run across outside of this arena, outside of these conversations that we record and post. When we're having a conversation with family over Thanksgiving or with buddies, so over the Monopoly table or whatever the wherever it might be, that the killer argument doesn't always land, and oftentimes we feel I guess disappointed, confused, or maybe we blame the other person for not hearing the argument, and so that's one of the reasons why I wanted us to talk about these things. So what has your experience been with this sort of thing?
I guess it's been pretty similar. Like in those cases, when I bring up the idea, I then, I can't remember how much I did it in that conversation. I know I did it some, but that and other conversations, my counterpoint to that argument was, there's a huge disincentive. And that didn't feel like it landed very well with you. I would say to you, hey, listen, we have examples. We've seen examples of in our life, and I felt like I made the point pretty well of, hey, if you work a little bit harder, you make less money. But it wasn't, that didn't really land with you. You're still kind of caught on, well, listen, they don't have enough money to live, so we should give them more help.
Okay, so
I would make a similar argument with Social Security. Like we set the goalpost for Social Security, and we said, hey, it's to make sure that especially old people, but people with disabilities, I forget what the three points you brought up that Social Security was for. It was like ensuring that old people, people with disabilities, and then there was one other.
Survivors of people that die.
Survivors, that they just have enough to survive, right? And if you're, depending on the situation, if you have a disability, we're not going to say just barely enough to survive so you have an incentive to work. Well, if you got a disability, you can't work that well, so we should probably just take really good care of those people.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody born with a mental issue or something, a mental deficiency, like, let's just help them. Like, that's the type of society I think we all want to live in. But now we have welfare, now we have food stamps, now we have all this stuff, and Social Security. It's kind of building on itself. There's all these entitlement programs, and people very often lose the incentive to work, but we don't, that doesn't seem to land with you. You don't seem to address that very much. Am I wrong?
Well, I want to go back to what you were saying about the people that we know that when they hit the threshold, they lose a large portion of the benefit. And my recollection of that conversation was that I agreed with you, and that we talked a little bit about the fact that it's often more effective if there's gradations or in decreasing the benefit. And then, but then I went on to something else, and so. At least that's how I recall the experience, was saying, yes, you're right, but there's also other things that are part of the problem as well. Now, were you expecting me to say, Colin, you're right, that would solve all the problems and we should stop the conversation now because I agree with you, or what?
Well, I guess what I'm saying is, your point from earlier was, hey, Colin, you didn't listen to me because I said, or, I thought I would, I guess not listen, you didn't listen to me, but I didn't convince you with my argument that, hey, listen, housing is expensive. Here's some data on it. That frankly would take a long time for me to go through, but here's some data on why housing is higher. Housing expenses in general are higher than the poverty threshold. So we need to help people more, right? And that didn't convince you, or that didn't convince me is what you're saying, but I'm telling you why, and you're still feeling that we should be, that I should have conceded. Does that make sense? So my counterpoint to your argument is, well, listen, the poverty threshold is here, housing costs are here, so obviously you can not even be in poverty and not afford housing in our country. So all these poor people can't afford housing, I guess is the argument you're making. And so shouldn't we do more, Colin? Right? That was your argument essentially?
Yeah, basically.
So my two counterpoints, aside from the fact that it seems like people are affording housing, so I'm not sure how valid those numbers are, but let's take for a moment the premise that those are valid numbers. Isn't it true, Brian, that I shouldn't concede that point because I think we've got a problem already? There's all these people that have this disincentive to work, and we're just talking about throwing more on top of it. Like, I don't think we should. I think the government is causing a huge problem here and creating a huge disincentive to work. So we're getting this we're getting this group of people that we're making it very, very hard for them to escape from poverty. And you're saying, well, Colin, we got to give them more money. And I'm saying, well, we should address what we're doing because it doesn't seem to be working. Poverty is getting worse. People are more reliant on government assistance than they were 20 or 30 years ago,
Yeah. One of the things in I think it was in that conversation that I thought was a really useful point that you brought up was about benchmarks, where that whenever a program is implemented, whenever a system is put in place, whether it's by the government or by corporations, is that you always want to be able to go back and take a look. And our intention was to do this, and so this was how we thought we would address the issue or solve the problem, and then going back and say, have we actually had a positive impact? Have we alleviated the issue that we're trying to address? And I do feel like that doesn't happen quite so much as it probably should. In not just in terms of government, in terms of the corporate culture, in terms of people's lives. How many people say I'm going to go on a diet and they change their food and nothing really changes, and they don't. How often does someone actually go back? Look at, well, this is what I changed as I getting the results that I was hoping to get. And so there is often not enough assessment, post game assessment, I guess you could say, about these things. That's part of the reason why I wanted to have this conversation, was to assess our conversations. Was there an expectation on your part in general that there would be maybe some dramatic changes in your perspective or my perspective on some of the points that we were going to be discussing?
Not really based on our history. I mean, I enjoy the conversation. I'm kind of an odd person. I don't, and maybe you are too, because a lot of people, it seems like, I don't know, I don't mind. I just like the conversation. I like kind of hashing the things out, but it does seem like people are pretty entrenched in their ideas. Mm-hmm. And it seems that I think the biggest problem that we have in having these discussions, people in general, not just you and I, is that people are emotional decision makers. Or they think about these things much more emotionally than they do logically. And I mean, I because of what I've read about it, I have to assume that I'm the same way. I feel like I'm pretty logical, and I would change my point of view, but you probably don't. So either one or both of us is holding on to these things kind of emotionally. For example, you hear something. Well, I don't know. It's difficult to explain exactly why it is, but from everything I've read about it, people typically hold on to things emotionally. And if you are, for example, a conservative or a Republican, or you're a Democrat or a liberal, or in my case, a libertarian, we typically have these viewpoints that we're holding on to. And everything we see it through the lens of, for example, if we see something online that supports our viewpoint, then we see all the good of that article, and we're not, poking holes in the argument. Sure. And if it's an article that is opposing our viewpoint, then we're poking holes in that article, and we're finding reasons for why it's wrong. And that's probably a lot of what happens with us. And I think with most people is we're more emotional than logical about it. And part of that is, I guess, a good reason for that is, for example, you make all those points about poverty and rent. It doesn't seem logical to me, but maybe it is true. I don't know, but I would suspect it's not going to sway me immediately because I haven't done my research on it, and I'm probably going to hold to my viewpoints and not concede just every time I hear one argument against me. I changed my point of view, and then I hear an argument against that, and I change my point of view. Like, we're not going to be that way. We're not going to be so quick to change our points of view, I would guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things that I've noticed, and this is, I think, before you and I started having these conversations, is that when I would have conversations with other people, usually not in such volatile subjects, but about trivial things, where maybe there's not such an emotional attachment to your perspective, it wasn't often that. Rarely would I find that someone would change their mind or come to agree with what I was saying in the argument, but oftentimes later on, days, weeks, months later, I would hear in the course of my interaction with this person that there's been a very small shift. There's been there was some small aspect of what it was that I'd said that they went and they were able to incorporate into their general worldview. And so I think that maybe that's why when we have these conversations, I don't get so I'm not so attached as to whether you end up agreeing with me or disagreeing with me. My hope is that at the end of the conversation, there's some little nugget that I presented that maybe you'll mull over, hash, and try and consider, and then maybe incorporate. And I'm not just talking about your approach, but in general. And I think that if we take that approach, then when we have these conversations over Thanksgiving dinner or with somebody at the bar, and they end up angry and emotional, and you go away saying, why didn't they get what I said? Why didn't they come to me and say, golly, you're right. What was I don't know what I was thinking. That was well thought out and great perspective, and now I'm going to go and change. And so if we don't expect the big change, but we acknowledge that maybe there's a small change that might gradually happen that we wouldn't get the acknowledgement for, that maybe we had some success.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's not I think that's a healthy thing to do. What's interesting, Brian, is maybe you should be hoping that you might learn something too.
Well, yeah.
You might have a change. You might have a change of heart or a change of perspective. It's not just the other person that you're trying to change. Like, you might learn something too, Brian.
Sure. I mean, you're right. I mean, there is the offensive and defensive, and that's not really, it's not the best way to think about it in those terms, but what I'm putting out there and what I'm receiving is probably a better way of framing it. And so when I'm putting something out there, I am hoping that part of my barrage will land. But you are correct that there hopefully that I will get some new information from the person that I'm talking to, and that I can incorporate it into my worldview as well. There was also something in the news today which I thought was interesting, that also tied into what we're talking about, which is, if you're following the Russia-Ukraine situation at all, one of the aspects that I've been curious about is what's going on within the country of Russia. And so whenever I see an article or something, I'll read about that. And they were saying that essentially over the past 12 years, Putin has been very gradually and slowly taking over the media in subtle ways. So, not so much that it's all now government-owned media, but it's all well regulated by the government. And those that are presenting oppositional viewpoints have been pushed out. And at this point, many of them have left the country. Many of them are afraid of being arrested. And so he's got control over what's happening. And so when we wonder why the Russians aren't more vocal in their lack of support, that's the reason why. They're only getting one side. And so as much as we may not like, we may feel that news we're getting is biased, at least there is some oppositional viewpoints. It's not being throttled by our government. Now, bias will still exist, of course, but we are more likely to. We have the ability to go and do some research and to find some other perspectives on that sort of thing, whereas they're having a harder time doing that. They're having to go around their government watchdog to do so.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of our conversation about the media.
Yeah. And in fact, what I'm creating a new category for some of the posts that I make, and I'm at this point I'm calling it analysis, but I need that's kind of bland and boring. I'll create a new category for it. But looking at some of the things that happen out there in the world that are directly related to conversations that we had. And my first post, which I'm right now going through making, was a look at the Washington Post, who does a really bad job of they show their bias in between the headline and the article itself, and they're one that I usually hold up as being a pretty good example of not being fully unbiased, but being fairly close to it. And in this particular article, they do a horrible job of it. And, I go through and show in just a few minutes how that happens. And side note, if you want to go and do some of these things as well, once you see it, maybe you can get, it'll kind of give you an idea of format or whatever, and you're welcome to do so too. But yeah, and because I do think that many people don't have that critical eye. And many people don't get the exposure to alternative viewpoints, which is why I do appreciate, even though I don't often agree with you, I appreciate these conversations, because it does give me the opportunity to get a viewpoint different than everyone else that agrees with it.
Yeah, it's amazing how so much of the mainstream media right now, it's so biased in both directions. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you want to hear anything about, you look at any story like the Hunter Biden story that's just come out recently, it's just so different on each side. I guess now it seems like at least now there's some admitting on the one side that there could be some truth to it, but yeah, for so long it was just so different, where one side was saying, oh, this is so damning for Hunter and for Joe Biden, and the other side was saying, no, this is disinformation, it's Russian disinformation, and both of them were probably overstating their case.
Mm-hmm.
And you just don't know what to believe. It doesn't feel like there's a good source to go to where you can feel like you're going to get unbiased information. It's almost like anytime you want to research any story and feel good about it, you've got to spend a lot of time. I mean, it's not just read an article or two. It's read 7 or 8 or 10, and then try to pick through, okay, well, who's being biased and who isn't. And at the end of it, you're only 70-80% sure that you have a clear picture of what's happening,
Sure.
Because that's how I feel about it.
Absolutely. And I think that Hunter Biden story is a great example, because I haven't done a lot of research on it, because what keeps on popping up is New York Post. And I'm not going to take anything the New York Post says seriously, because they have such a history of putting out trash. So they may be 100% accurate on that, but I'm not going to listen to it and this is the boy that cried wolf. You can't keep on putting out garbage and say, oh, but this time I'm telling you the truth. This time I'm being honest. Doesn't matter. No one's going to listen to you.
Yeah, well, that is a great point, because, the New York Post is apparently talking about an article that the New York Times wrote, where they have made some concessions that there could be some truth to it.
Mm-hmm.
But somebody from a left-leaning viewpoint, I think there's so much that goes into, there's such a filter that for what comes to us from social media, from the media outlets that we're looking at, that if you're on the right now, you're thinking, we've got our argument, we've proven it. And if you're on the left, you're like, that's, it's just the New York Post. I'm not going to listen to it. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't know who's right and who's wrong, because it's one more thing that you just have to read 7 or 8 or 10 articles to figure out. But if you're on the left, you're thinking, that's a waste of time. If you're on the right, you're thinking, yep, this proves it. Biden shouldn't be in office. You know what I mean? Like, there's just such a disparity on how both sides are looking at it.
Yeah. And actually, if we stick on the topic of things that we've covered and discussed, I did hear someone talking about Joe Rogan and his podcast. I don't know if you listen to Sam Harris at all, but yeah, I like his podcasts. And he discussed Joe Rogan and the apology that Joe Rogan put out recently, and he was saying that Joe Rogan started out as an entertainer, and he happens to bring people on and have free form conversations with them, and for most topics that's fine, but when you're bringing on someone that might be spreading disinformation, and you are the most popular podcast in the world, now some people might view this as conflicting. Some people will say, well, he's just having the conversation and learning as he goes, which can be fine. But when the information that's being presented could actually harm people's lives, then some people would say, well, now you've got a duty to your listeners. And I'm not saying one way or the other. It was just a perspective. And Sam Harris goes on to say that he really admired Joe Rogan for apologizing for some of these things, because he does have the most listened to podcast in the country. He doesn't have to apologize. He could say, this is what I am and this is what I do, and deal with it. Now, some will argue he's doing it for the money, because he's now part of Spotify and he wants to stay part of that network. He's probably making a lot of money from that. Yeah. And he could also go independent and still have all of his listeners. And so he doesn't have to apologize. Now, I still don't agree with everything that he does, but it was interesting to hear the perspective on someone who is Sam Harris, who is very careful about who he brings onto his podcast, who he gives that platform to, and does a lot of background and a lot of research in justifying Joe Rogan and who he has conversations with.
Yeah, I mean, Joe Rogan says some crazy stuff, but I think he's pretty intellectually honest with himself and with others, and I think he's made some mistakes, and he owns it later on. I think, although he is a little bit crazy, I think he does a much better job than many, for example, of the and he's not a media outlet in the same sense, but he does a much better job than the mainstream media outlets of owning the mistakes, of really trying pretty hard to be unbiased, in the sense that he brings a lot of people on and he talks about these viewpoints. Like our whole point was how biased he was, but he does seem to change over time. He does seem to learn. I don't think I don't think the problem with him is as much the bias. It's the kind of crazy, outlandish. Maybe it's the too much weed that he's smoking. He has these crazy, outlandish viewpoints at times. Which you're right. I don't know. You said before. Well, he has a duty to his listeners. Yeah, what is the duty? I mean, the duty is for him to be honest, which I think he does. And you might say, well, he shouldn't spread disinformation and bring people on and give them a platform if they're wrong. Many times, it's difficult to know that they're wrong until you bring them on and give them a chance to talk about this stuff. And our viewpoints on things change over time. Like everybody says, that brings up an interesting point. All these things that they've said about, the Russian disinformation, the Hunter Biden laptop. If stuff comes out later that some of that stuff was true, that the laptop really was Hunter's laptop, and social media, Facebook, Instagram, news outlets that were saying, no, that's false, it's disinformation, and they weren't even reporting on it, and then we find out that there was some truth to it, that's going to hurt a little bit, because then you say, well, don't bring people on that aren't telling the truth. Well, how do you know the truth right from the beginning? These are new developing stories, you know what I mean? It's an easy thing to look at somebody and say, don't spread misinformation, but what exactly is misinformation, if that makes any sense?
Yeah, it does. And it also brings up the idea that some people who become celebrities have a very broad reach. And when somebody then who has that reach is putting forth opinions, perspectives, do they have any sort of obligation to what it is that they're saying? If you look at, an athlete, a celebrity athlete, a celebrity musician, a celebrity who is putting things out there that, the world is flat, and puts forth some bizarre reason as to why that would be the case. And, or one that's been very, very potent very recently is about people putting out their beliefs on COVID. Who are making millions of dollars a year and have hundreds of thousands of followers on various social media platforms and are putting out their opinion. And people give that opinion credence simply because they have that reach. And rather than saying, well, an athlete just gave me his opinion. He didn't give me his opinion on athleticism. He gave me his opinion on microbiology. And so we don't often make that distinction. And is there any sort of obligation to, policing yourself in terms of what you're putting out there and because of the people that are listening to you?
Yeah, I mean, there's an obligation, I guess. It's funny how it seems that you're so much more, I don't know, there seems to be a disconnect in what you say there, because even as I talk with you, when we talked about the media, you were saying, well, you have to do your research. You have to dig in. You can't just read the titles and everything. And you don't seem to see that issue that you're bringing up seems much more of a problem. And both because they do it more, well, maybe they don't do it more, both because it happens so frequently and because they don't seem, because they're more, we should expect more from them than we should from an athlete or Joe Rogan or these other people. But it seems such a big problem in the mainstream media outlets, and you don't seem to see it as a big problem in the media outlets, but you seem to see it as such a big problem everywhere else. You know what I mean?
I would disagree. I mean, I do recognize the problem. I mean, I know that it does happen. I don't think it happens as well. I mean, they're putting out news 24 hours a day. They're, that's the constant streaming of information to the world. And there are some that make mistakes on a frequent basis, some that don't bother to acknowledge their mistakes. I mean, all these things happen. I I mean, like I said, I am holding Washington Post to task for some of the biases that they're putting forth. I think that they generally do a pretty good job. I think that it's one of those situations where we don't notice when they're doing their job well. We only notice when they're making mistakes. How many times do we know people like that only point out our flaws and never point out all our admirable qualities? And I think this is one of those situations when you're talking about the media that often happens.
Mm-hmm.
And when I'm talking about the celebrities, I'm not. I think Joe Rogan is a special situation, but when an athlete does put forth an opinion on COVID-19, or a movie star about the flatness or roundness of the Earth, I'm not putting forth an opinion on that right now. I'm just saying this is what happens. They have the audience and they're putting forth an opinion, and is it something that we should have have an opinion on, or be concerned with? And I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a valid point. There are celebrity does give you an opportunity to say some stupid things and to weigh in on subjects that you probably aren't an expert on. The thing I like about the Joe Rogan podcast, he gets kind of a. I don't watch it. I usually just typically, it's just too long. I see clips of it, and plus I do disagree with a lot of things that he says. But what I really admire about it is it's so open. The mainstream media, what I typically see with them is if it's the Washington Post, it's going to kind of align with what the Democrats are saying. If it's Fox News, it's going to kind of align with what the Republicans are saying. Joe Rogan brings a lot of different people on, and he just hashes it out. They're on the air. I think and he's pretty healthy in the way he thinks about it. Mm-hmm. It's not. That's why I would say it's less biased. It may at times promote misinformation, which all of us do, which the media outlets oftentimes do, which the politicians do. But at the very least, he's kind of humble and open about it and says, he brings a lot of different people on with differing viewpoints and then hashes it out with them. I think I'm surprised that you are so critical of him and so much less critical of the media, which is so clearly aligning with a political party that seems to be the fan base of those outlets. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And of course, I would not agree with you on that point, but that's one of the things that maybe over time you can start to work your way into my psyche and change my opinion on. Now, if we look forward, is there anything that you feel we should do differently, that we can, topics or methods that we can address? Any feelings?
Well, maybe, I don't know, just an idea. Maybe it won't work, but maybe when we do feel that we have a clincher argument, we should bring it up and say, hey, this is one I think we should address and should be, for example, if you have that, something like that, I felt you had that viewpoint or that argument with the data that talked about the poverty line and the rent levels and everything. I had what I thought was a pretty good argument with Social Security, where I said, listen, it doesn't allow for intergenerational wealth because, if you have put 12% of your income into Social Security, when you die, it's all gone, and you can't pass that on to your children. Maybe we should kind of focus on those a little bit, and if we can beforehand, bring them up and say, hey, this is one that I want to address because I feel like this is a really a key point or an important point that we should face, and so be ready for it, and let's talk about it because I feel like it should be answered in the course of the conversation.
I think it's a good point, and just to for clarity and transparency for our many listeners, when you and I first started, we had that shared document where we would keep notes of where our research was taking us. And the reason for that is that we're coming on these conversations not wanting to surprise the other person with this, this killer argument, because then the other person isn't prepared to address the points. We want the other person to understand where we're coming so that they have, as you say, the information with which to address it. And I feel like in the last couple of conversations, we haven't been keeping up with that. And I think that would be a great place in which we could perhaps do that. If we have our research points and then maybe highlight ones that we feel like, or maybe even, outline the premise of where we think we might go with it, if we feel like it really is worth discussing in detail and focusing on it. Would you agree?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. The other change that's happened is that I just created a Twitter account for us. I will, it's going to take me a little while to kind of get things ramped up and going, but, I'll give you access to that as well, Colin, and feel free to, spout your steam.
That would be funny if we, at one point it's like a really libertarian viewpoint, and then the next tweet is like this really left-leaning viewpoint. We're like, who is this guy? Who are these guys? Like they're so schizophrenic.
Either schizophrenic or they're very broad in their willingness to approach and look at different ideas. Mm-hmm.
They'll believe anything.
Yeah. You and I had a short conversation a couple days ago. We were talking about gas. Is that something you still want to have one of these longer form conversations on?
Yeah.
Okay. So the next conversation will be on gas prices, gas availability, all of that. See where it goes.
Okay. Sounds good.
Yeah, and I feel like every once in a while, Colin, we should maybe have these conversations again, just to kind of assess where it's all going, how it's all, how we feel it's going, anything that we need to do differently, because I don't want to end up in a place where one of us is feeling like either they're not being heard or this is maybe going down a road that's not effective, and make sure that we keep this where we're both enjoying it.
Okay, sounds good.
Cool. Thanks, Colin.
All right, Brian.
Bye.
We hope you learned something in this episode of Brother versus Brother, a podcast about difficult conversations. We also hope that you enjoyed it enough to subscribe to the podcast. You can help us by spreading the word. Share this episode on your favorite social media so that others will have an opportunity to experience it as well. You can also support us by donating through Patreon. This information and more can be found on our website, broconvo.com, and on our various social media accounts. Thank you.